Hey, this is Rafael. I want to add a little bit more perspective to this. My focus is driving results with organizations. Now, in your situation, if you don't know the actual work, that's okay. If you follow some simple rules and and understand what these are, you don't need to know all the details just yet. Yeah, at some point you're going to be able to understand those, but as a manager, you don't need to know every single little detail of the work. So let me explain. So the first thing you have to do, first and fundamentally, you have to create what's called an activity list. A list of all the jobs, right? Whatever that is, the frequency per week, how many times each job done, then the reasonable expectation of each of the jobs. That's the most important thing. When I say reasonable expectation is how long does it take to do this one job? But the thing about reasonable expectation, if you haven't validated that number correctly, it includes fluff. So whatever number is in there historically, or they gave you the number, or you're asking your employees, hey, how long does this job take? And they tell you X, you have to realize that there's some fluff in there. So the second thing, so let's stay on this topic. So that in itself will give you an idea of all the work that's being done, how often it's being done per week, then what's the reasonable expectation for one of those activities? Think about that for a second. You don't need to know, as a manager, you don't need to know all the details, but guess what? With that reasonable expectation, what do you think you can do with that? That's right. You set expectations based upon that number. Knowing that there's fluff, guess what? You have to validate that number. For example, if one activity, we'll take the first one, you do it say for example, you do it 10 times a week, whatever that is, and it takes you 60 minutes to do one. And you realize that there's fluff in there because you just know. I know because I've been doing this for quite some time. And you say, okay, 60 minutes. Then for you to make an improvement in this entire thing, because that's what you're there for, to make improvements, then the question then becomes, how do I validate that 60 minutes to be true? Because it can be 60 minutes, it can be 70 minutes or 90 minutes, or it can be 30 minutes. But how do you validate that? The way you do that is through what's called an observation. You literally have to observe the work at minimal 3 data points to say, I saw the work, I know what it is from start to finish, and I can validate on the 3 data points, on average, it was 47 minutes. That doesn't mean that the employee's working any faster. That's just taking the fluff out so that you can say, hey, if there's no more fluff in there or very little fluff, there's some lost time in there. But now you're at a point where you're at 47 minutes and still doing it at a reasonable rate. The employees are not going any faster. They're just going at a reasonable rate. But guess what? The procrastination theory doesn't play in here because procrastination theory says employees fill the time with work, whatever time it is. So you're fixing that there. So understanding the concept of reasonable expectations relative to your activities is probably the most important thing you can do in your situation where you're not feeling with your craft. That's okay. You don't need to know the craft in detail, but guess what? You need to understand what the reasonable expectation is and how to get there, because the question becomes, okay, if it is 60 minutes and I did observations and you saw the work from start to finish 10 different times, and guess what? It's actually 37 minutes. The question then becomes, how do you convince your people that it's not 60 minutes and you have to get to 37 minutes because that's where the real opportunity is? That is the leadership challenge that you have, because you can't live with 60 minutes anymore. You know for a fact that it can be done at 37. So that delta is your job to convince people, and they're going to say, well, you don't know the job and you don't know this. I get it. I don't know it. But guess what? I did 10 observations. Here's what it comes out to. I know the data. I understand all that. Is this not correct? I had everyone sign off on this from whoever I did the observation with, and they did it correctly. Is this not true? Is this not correct? You begin leveraging that argument based on the observations that you did as a manager to validate that data point in the reasonable expectations. then there's no room to argue with that. So you don't need to know the details of it. At some point you will, but guess what? You need to know the process, how to get there, both from that, the KPIs, and understanding barriers. Those three things will put you in a position of knowing what the heck is going on, even if you don't know the data, or even if you don't know the details of every wrench or everything that they're doing. You don't need to know that. What you do need to know is how to set expectations correctly. And the only way you can do that is by doing what I just told you. Hope that helps.